Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to look at a massive, largely unseen system that quietly dictates the modern world. I'm incredibly excited to share this with you because once you see this invisible engine, I promise you, you're never going to look at global news, international energy, or even your own money the exact same way ever again. Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to take a guess right now. What system actually runs the world? Like, what controls everything from the price of your groceries on the shelf to global energy flows to international government policies? Now, your first instinct might be to point to the global banking system, or, maybe you're thinking of the stock market. But actually, scratch that, it's neither of those. The answer is the petrodollar. For over 50 years, this single, insanely powerful system has been fundamentally shaping our globe. To really understand why it's so overwhelmingly powerful, we have to recognize one fundamental truth, which is that our entire modern economy depends on oil for absolutely everything. And I don't just mean the gasoline we use to fuel cars, planes, and massive cargo ships. We literally use oil to make plastics for our medical devices and our electronics. In a lot of places, it directly produces the electricity we need just to turn the lights on. It's even a core ingredient used to manufacture the fertilizers that grow the food we eat. So, because every single aspect of modern life relies on oil, the system that controls oil, by extension, basically controls everything else. Section 1. From gold to oil. Let's take a really quick historical detour to see exactly how the US dollar became the undisputed boss of this massive global market. So, going back to the end of World War II, the United States emerged with its economy and manufacturing base largely untouched, which was totally unlike the rest of the world at the time. So, in 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, countries essentially agreed to make the US dollar the center of the global financial system. And this came with a strict promise: dollars could always be exchanged for physical gold. But fast forward to 1971, and President Nixon abruptly decoupled the U.S. economy from the gold standard. This was a monumental move known as the Nixon shock. And then, just 2 years later, in 1973, the OPEC oil crisis hit. Arab oil-producing countries stopped selling oil to nations supporting Israel. This caused global oil prices to quadruple almost overnight. I mean, we're talking severe inflation, miles-long gas lines, and massive shortages throughout the West. That 1971 Nixon shock is absolutely vital to understand because it rapidly transitioned the whole world into a fiat currency economy. Now, a fiat currency is simply government-issued money that isn't backed by a physical commodity like gold or silver. Instead, it relies entirely on public trust and economic stability. So when the US stopped backing dollars with gold, the dollar actually stayed dominant. Why? Well, primarily because the US economy was incredibly huge, the government was stable, and the dollar was already the standard for global transactions anyway. It basically became the world's default reserve currency. But that severe 1973 oil crisis threatened to upend the whole shebang. So the crucial point is how the United States responded to that crisis. They approached Saudi Arabia, one of the world's absolute largest oil producers, and struck a genius deal. The agreement was simple but totally unprecedented. Saudi Arabia would price and sell all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide comprehensive military protection and support. And because Saudi Arabia was the heavyweight champion of global oil production, the other major oil-producing countries pretty much had to follow suit. And just like that, the petrodollar was officially born. Section 2. The oil for dollar cycle. Now that we know how it started, let's look at the core mechanics of how this system actually functions today. I like to think of this as the global arcade token system. Imagine a massive, inescapable arcade where there is literally only one game that every single person has to play just to survive. That game is oil. But the machines only accept one specific type of token, and that's the US dollar. So if you're a country like Japan, a highly developed nation that consumes a massive amount of oil but produces very little of its own, you're in a tricky spot. You can't just go to the global market and buy oil with your own currency, the yen. They simply won't accept it. First, you have to acquire US dollars. You have to trade goods with the US, hold US financial assets, and constantly build up a massive reserve of these specific arcade tokens, all just so you can keep the lights on and the factories running back home. And that right there brings us to the absolute golden rule of the modern global economy. If every country needs oil, and oil is exclusively sold in dollars, then every country needs dollars. This fundamental reality creates a permanent, unending, massive global demand for United States currency, no matter what is actually happening inside the US itself. Section 3. Petrodollar recycling explained. But wait, where does all this money actually go once it's handed over to those oil-producing nations? I mean, they certainly aren't just shoving billions of dollars under a giant mattress. This introduces a really brilliant macroeconomic concept called petrodollar recycling. When Saudi Arabia or other major oil producers sell their oil, they end up holding literal mountains of US dollars. But instead of just sitting on static paper cash that's losing value to inflation, they put that money to work. They intelligently invest it right back into the very same system that printed it. Let's move forward and see how this builds into what we can playfully call the VIP casino loop. First, the producing nations sell their oil exclusively for dollars. Second, they earn massive, unprecedented dollar reserves. Third, instead of cashing out and walking away, they invest those dollars right back into U.S. assets. So they're buying up massive amounts of U.S. government bonds, prime American real estate, and shares in booming global companies. Fourth, this constant influx of investment flowing right back into America keeps the dollar incredibly strong. It's really a perfect, self-sustaining loop that continually strengthens the overall American economy. Section 4, America's ultimate financial weapon. Let's look at America's unique advantage here and the unbelievable level of geopolitical and financial influence this system grants the United States. Let's objectively examine the immense advantages this provides the U.S. First, as we just noted, it keeps the dollar artificially strong because the entire world is quite literally forced to buy it. Second, it allows the U.S. government to borrow money much more easily and at much lower interest rates because there's always a guaranteed built-in global buyer for U.S. debt. And third, it deeply empowers the U.S. to weaponize its currency. Because so many international transactions are forced to flow through U.S.-based banks just to clear those dollar payments, the United States can easily apply severe financial sanctions against adversaries, effectively cutting them off from the global arcade entirely. Section 5. Threats to the dollar. However, absolutely no system lasts forever without facing a few significant challenges along the way. Let's look at the modern complications and how some nations are trying to break free from this loop. In recent years, an economic alliance known as BRICS, which includes countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with nations like Venezuela and Pakistan, have been actively trying to reduce their long-standing dependence on the dollar. They're aggressively exploring ways to trade oil using alternative global currencies, like the euro, the Chinese yuan, or the Russian ruble. But that brings up the million-dollar question, quite literally. If you have countries that are actively hostile to the United States, why are they largely still trading oil in US dollars today? Why not just flip the switch and stop tomorrow? Well, completely moving away from the petrodollar is incredibly logistically difficult. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why, using a modern social media analogy. Think of the US dollar kind of like Twitter or X. It has exceptionally high liquidity, meaning you can instantly move billions without crashing the market. It has decades of established financial contracts, reliable pricing models, robust insurance, and incredibly strong legal protections. Quite simply, everybody is already on it. Trying to switch the global economy to an alternative currency is a lot like when Facebook launched Threads. It might be shiny, it might be heavily promoted, and some might genuinely want to use it for their own political reasons, but it completely lacks the massive, deeply established infrastructure. You simply can't get the whole world to abandon ship and change platforms overnight when the entire global economy is already hardwired straight into the dollar network. Because of this massive hurdle, what we're seeing right now isn't a sudden overnight revolution, but a slow and gradual shift. Russia is increasingly trading its oil with China using the yuan, and they're settling some specific transactions in rubles, particularly as a direct measure to bypass strict U.S. sanctions. Meanwhile, China is actively promoting yuan-denominated oil contracts with its major trading partners. So these nations are selectively reducing their dollar use precisely where it's politically necessary, while quietly still relying on the dollar for its unmatched convenience, stability, and efficiency everywhere else. Now, what's really interesting here is the real question we're left with. We are currently witnessing a slow fracturing of a deeply entrenched 50-year-old system. So is the petrodollar truly dying, or is this invisible global engine merely changing gears to adapt to a new century? It's a fascinating, complex puzzle of global geopolitics and high finance, and how it ultimately resolves is undoubtedly going to determine the future balance of global power. So keep a close eye on those global energy trades because the currency they use tells the real story. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the systems that quietly run our world.